are certain things that an officer is going to want to see in a roadside inspection. And we see so many violations stem from drivers just not having expected that and then being unable to provide what the officer needs to see. You can avoid that by just taking a little bit of time ahead of time to understand what the officer is going to want to see, and then making sure that when you're driving down the road, you know where you can find that if you need to find it.
Welcome to Drive, the podcast for truck drivers who are looking to enhance their lives both on and off the road, and for carriers looking for that perfect fit trucker. I'm Zach Ellis.
And I'm Chelsea Faulkner.
And we're here to bring you conversations that will help keep you moving forward in every area of your life. Whether you're a seasoned trucker or just starting out in the industry, this is a show for you.
Hey guys, Chelsea here with Drive. And today I have the pleasure of bringing you guys an amazingly insightful episode with Brandon Wiseman, the founder of TruckSafe. Brandon is a transportation attorney who's been practicing for years and brings so much insight into DOT regulations and policies, as well as some amazing information about inspections and the incoming administration and how it's going to affect policies moving forward. So I hope that you'll join me for this upcoming episode, as I'm very excited to share it with you and can't wait to see what you guys take away from it. Let's listen in. Can you start by telling me just a little bit more about yourself and how you came to be in the industry?
Sure. Well, first of all, I went to law school. After undergrad, kind of always planned on becoming a lawyer. My dad was a lawyer. And so went to law school in Indiana, and then out of law school, went to work for a law firm in Indianapolis, a fairly large law firm that specialized in transportation. So I think we had about 100 attorneys when I was there, and everybody worked with trucking companies primarily. I think we represented like 95 of the top 100 trucking companies in the U.S. And so did that for many years. My focus while there was always on DOT safety and compliance. So helping large fleets with their compliance programs, making sure that they were doing things right, from, everything from hiring drivers, looking at their policies, doing mock DOT audits, helping them through real audits, that type of stuff. Got a lot of good experience doing that. And then in 2021, in the middle of the pandemic, decided that was a good time to break off on my own and started my own thing. Started a couple of businesses. One was a small law firm with a partner of mine. It's called the Childress Law Firm. And we continue to practice law in this niche area of DOT safety regs through that firm. But then we also started TruckSafe, which is our consulting company. And it's through TruckSafe that we deliver a lot of educational content on DOT safety regulations. So we've got a YouTube channel with a decent sized following where we do a lot of short videos on all kinds of DOT compliance topics. We've got a podcast of our own called TruckSafe Live that we invite a lot of guests on from the industry to talk about these issues. We have a TruckSafe Compliance Network. It's like a social media network for safety professionals from fleets to gather together and learn from one another. So we've got a lot of stuff going on over at TruckSafe, but that's kind of my background in a nutshell.
Absolutely. And with all of the experience that you have as a professional in the industry, and from being an attorney and then moving into TruckSafe and everything that you're doing there, what are some of the key challenges that you're currently seeing with drivers and carriers that are facing in the industry today?
Far and away, the biggest challenge that I see, and this has been consistent over my entire career doing this, has been just fleets and drivers, particularly fleets, not being proactive when it comes to safety and compliance. Too often, fleets are coming to me and to others like me, safety consultants or attorneys, after stuff has hit the fan. Either they are now in the midst of a DOT audit, or they are in the midst of a lawsuit following a significant accident. And at that point, there's only so much you can do. Had you had done the work ahead of time and spent a little bit of time and effort getting a better handle on what the regulations require of you, and making sure that your fleet was in compliance with those rules, then maybe you could have avoided the situation altogether. So I've been preaching it for 15 years now that fleets and drivers to some extent need to be proactive with this stuff. Understand that you are in a highly regulated industry and that the government expects a lot of you. And if you don't do what the government expects of you, then that is easy pickings for both the DOT if they're coming in to do an audit, or roadside if you've got a law enforcement doing a roadside inspection, and certainly the plaintiff's bar if, God forbid, you ever get involved in a bad accident. So,
absolutely. And working with some of those fleets, some of those drivers, what are the most common violations that you see?
Yeah, so this data is actually publicly available. You can get on the FMCSA's, it's called their A&I website, and you can, and they're gathering data that documents the top violations that are being discovered roadside and also in their audits. And I think, if you're looking at it from a roadside perspective, from a driver standpoint, the top violations that you see are pretty consistent year to year. On the driver side of things, the far and away the most common violation that gets discovered roadside is speeding. And, not a whole lot to say about that other than quit speeding. If you don't want to get caught with a speeding violation, not much more you can do than quit speeding, slow down. But beyond that, the next most common violation, I think, is log falsification, which is particularly troubling. Log falsification comes about in several different ways. I think nowadays the most common instance of log falsification is from drivers misusing what's called personal conveyance status on their electronic logging device. And it's, in my experience, that stems largely from just a misunderstanding of what personal conveyance is and who can use it. So there's an educational component to that. Fleets and drivers need to get up to speed on what is a legitimate use of personal conveyance or not. Unfortunately, it is a driver or a carrier or both trying to avoid the substantive hours of service rules and finding ways to get around those rules. And one way that they do so is by misusing personal conveyance status. And there are other ways that end up with log falsifications as well. Unassigned driving time comes to mind. But those are serious violations that carry heavy point values on the carrier's CSA scores. So they negatively impact the scores, and then they routinely lead to audits, and they also cause problems in highway accident litigation. But more importantly than that, the hours of service rules, as we all know, are intended to curb fatigued driving. And if you are a driver or a carrier that is deliberately falsifying logs to try and get around those rules, then putting aside the regulatory risk, you are risking having drivers out there operating on the roads that are fatigued. It's particularly prevalent in certain segments of the industry. You'll see this in oil field, for example, or at agricultural operations that are largely exempt from a lot of the hours of service rules. But then you end up seeing drivers out there on the roadways after having worked a 16 or 17-hour day. And it's just a bad idea to put drivers out there driving, potentially 80,000-pound trucks after working that long. It routinely leads to significant accidents. So I would say, to answer your question, those are the most common violations we see roadside. And also log falsification violations in audits come up very frequently, and it very frequently sinks carriers in those audits. It causes them to fail those audits. And so, we put out a lot of content over the years on those issues specifically and how carriers and drivers can get control of them, but they need to get control of them or else they're going to suffer the consequence.
Absolutely. And talking to drivers myself on a regular basis, I know that one of the things that I hear a lot come up is the fact that they've worked with companies in the past who have asked them to do those unsafe things, asked them to falsify those records, asked them to come in and say, hey, maybe I really wasn't out on the road as long as I was, and just kind of smidge things a little bit. And they go back to these carriers, and these carriers are not receptive to them having those conversations. They don't want to hear it. They immediately want to shut it down. How do you think we go about bridging that gap? That way drivers don't feel like they're being targeted when they're having those conversations.
Well, one thing drivers can do, and that's available to them, it's a tool that's available to them, is there have been laws on the books for years at this point that make it illegal for carriers to coerce their drivers into violating the hours of service rules. And not just carriers, shippers and brokers are prohibited from coercing drivers into violating the hours of service rules. And there's a complaint hotline that the FMCSA has set up where drivers can go and submit a complaint, and those routinely lead the FMCSA to start an investigation on the carrier that gets complained against. So if you are working for a carrier that is coercing you to violate the rules, then I recommend you take advantage of that platform that's available to you to rat them out. We shouldn't have carriers out there that are coercing drivers to violate the law. Obviously, that is bad for everybody involved. Beyond that, if you are a carrier that is doing it, stop it, obviously. You're not only putting yourself at risk, you're putting everybody, the motoring public, at risk by doing that. And you shouldn't be in business if that is your mindset. And so, there's only so much you can do for carriers that are dead set on running that type of business. Eventually, they will get weeded out one way or the other. Unfortunately, too often it happens at the expense of somebody's life. And so, we got to crack down on it. And there are avenues to crack down on it.
For drivers' information, anybody that's seeking out that platform in order to try to more or less whistle-blow on what's going on at work, what does the retaliation look like on that? Like, are they completely guarded with what's going on whenever they're reporting that? Is that anonymous? What does that look like?
Yeah, in my experience, it is anonymous. The hotline is there. So the way that it is handled is that the FMCSA receives the initial complaint from the driver. I think the driver does have to provide their contact information because the FMCSA has to have a way of investigating it. They're not just going to take completely anonymous tips without any supporting evidence. So they are going to talk with the driver. But in my experience, that information doesn't necessarily get disclosed to the carrier that is being investigated. I would have to look to see if there is a specific protection in the regulations for the anonymity of the driver. I don't want to say that that's for sure. But
Right.
If nothing else, I can say by experience, the FMCSA does routinely investigate those complaints. And so if the complaint gets filed, the FMCSA talks with the driver's able to substantiate the coercion, then the FMCSA will go and will investigate the carrier. And if they can substantiate it through their investigation, then they will take action against the carrier. It happens all the time.
No, I absolutely love this conversation because I know the information's out there. I know it's all published. But I also know that it's kind of a lost art of having to go and dig for that information. And when people have to start digging for it, they kind of start to feel like, well, maybe it's not out there publicly for me in a way that's easy to digest because I'm not supposed to be going after that to advocate for myself. Or maybe my company doesn't want to talk about it because they don't want me finding that because they are going to retaliate if I start asking questions. So I love the fact that you guys are putting all of this content out there. You're making it easy to digest. You're making it easy for drivers to access. So they don't have to go looking for it. It's something that can be very easily brought to them. And those conversations that are really rough can be had on a much easier basis.
The federal motor carrier safety regulations in particular are fairly complex. I mean, we're looking at thousands of rules that drivers and fleets are supposed to be complying with. And if you haven't done your due diligence as a fleet or as a driver to understand what is required of you, you're inevitably going to run into trouble. And so, education plays a big role in it. There are lots of great resources where you can go and get basic information about what is expected of you, who is subject to these rules, what are the maximum number of hours I can work? What types of license do I need? What types of endorsements? All of that is readily available if you just go and search it out. The FMCSA, to its credit, has a lot of great resources online. But that's something that we wanted to be a part of, was kind of breaking what could be complex rules down into their basic components and then getting it out there in a place where I think drivers and carriers are, which is YouTube and social media and other places like that, where that content is easily accessible.
Absolutely. Now, we all know that there have been quite a few recent changes with the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse and everything that's coming down the pipes with them. Can you speak to any of those changes and what it means for drivers and carriers?
Yeah, the most recent change came in November of 2024, and this was called Clearinghouse Phase 2. So, just by way of quick background, the Clearinghouse, for those who aren't familiar with it, hopefully you are, if you're a CDL driver or you are a fleet that hires CDL drivers. Clearinghouse is a central repository for drug and alcohol testing violation data for all CDL drivers in the United States. It is meant to be a place where employers, existing employers and subsequent employers of CDL drivers go to learn whether the drivers that they have currently hired or are looking to hire are prohibited from operating a commercial motor vehicle due to a past drug or alcohol testing violation. And so the system has now been in place since 2020, and it has been accumulating data over that time frame, and we have a significant amount of data in the system. As of when we are recording this episode, I think the latest numbers I saw, there are currently over 180,000 CDL drivers in so-called prohibited status in the clearinghouse due to a past drug or alcohol testing violation. I mean, that's a huge universe of unavailable drivers. And so, the system is there to give visibility into that fact to employers of these drivers so they don't end up putting these drivers on the road unless and until those drivers go through the regulatory return to duty process. It's a multi-step process that they have to go through if they want to get back in the truck. But the latest change that happened in November of 2024 was phase 2 of this system, which is to link that system with the state driver's licensing agencies, the ones that issue the CDLs to the drivers or upgrade them or renew them. Nowadays, after November 2024, the states are now required to utilize the clearinghouse and to check a driver's status in the clearinghouse. And if they see that a driver is in prohibited status, then the state has to take action to downgrade that driver's CDL to a standard operator's license, because it doesn't make sense for them to continue to have a CDL if they are prohibited from operating a commercial motor vehicle. And so the linking of those two systems kind of fills a gap that we have had since the implementation of the clearinghouse. So that is the current status of the clearinghouse.
Absolutely. Now, being around since the implementation of the clearinghouse, I came into the industry right before they started implementing all of that. So I went through the headache of trying to get all of the drivers registered with it and what that looks like for everybody that we had on staff. Now, coming through that, one of the things that we've seen quite a bit is these drivers that are coming in and they're applying to work with us, and they don't realize that they have a failed or refused drug screen on their clearinghouse until we go to run it. Because maybe they were set up for a drug screen with another company and the company didn't come back and tell them about it, or somebody forgot to send that paperwork over to them. And now this driver is saying, oh, well, I was put down for a refusal. They didn't even tell me they set me up. So what do we see the barriers being with that as that continues to roll out?
Yeah, it's pretty common, unfortunately, for something like that to happen. If there's any good news there is that the FMCSA has set up an appeals process that a driver could go through if they want to challenge data that's in the system erroneously. Now, it has to be erroneous to get it taken off. If you legitimately got called for a random test and you just didn't show up at the site, that is a legitimate refusal, and you're going to suffer the same consequences as if you tested positive for that test. But just know that if there's a legitimate reason to challenge data in the clearinghouse, that is available to you. You could just go to the FMCSA's clearinghouse website and you can find information on how to do that, and I recommend you do that, because you're right. I mean, if they've got negative information about them on the clearinghouse, that's going to cause significant problems for them as they go to try and seek work at somebody else that's looking to hire them. They're not going to be able to get that work because they're in prohibited status. So, big problem.
Absolutely. And there for the longest time, we've had so many drivers that are applying to several jobs at a time. And it's not uncommon for us to end up seeing that on the side where they've been set up for a drug screen and just nobody communicated it to them. And it went registered as, oh, well, they didn't show up, so now they've refused. Have you seen any drivers that have appealed that process, and how quickly does that go through?
Yeah, I have. But to the point here about pre-employment drug screens. So a driver not showing up to a pre-employment drug screen is not supposed to be reported to the clearinghouse as a refusal. It is one of the exceptions to the definition of a refusal in the drug and alcohol testing regulations. Now, other kinds of required test types, random, post-accident, if the driver doesn't show up, that constitutes a refusal. But if they just don't show up to a scheduled pre-employment test, that is not a refusal and is not supposed to be reported to the clearinghouse. So that is a mistake. And that's the type of situation where I would recommend that the drivers go through that appeals process. And yeah, I have seen drivers try and go through that. It does seem to take a while. The FMCSA is pretty short-staffed, and so that ends up with these things taking a while to go through the process. So I've seen it take a couple of months to get through the process. FMCSA, for its part, is having to gather information from the driver and from the carrier and figure out whether it was reported correctly or not. And so they have to go through that adjudication process. So yeah, it can take some time.
For sure. And It's unfortunate when it happens. I know we've talked to the drivers, and we've also talked to the company, especially when everything first started rolling out with the clearinghouse, where the company just didn't realize that's not how they were supposed to report it. And they're like, well, now we don't know what to do with it. So knowing that they have an avenue that they can explore, and even though it does take a couple of months, it's something that they can work through. That's amazing, because I've seen several drivers that have just went through the SAP program because they thought that's what they had to do in order to get this fixed. And while it wasn't their mistake, they really wanted their CDL and they wanted to retain that and keep it in good status. So that's awesome to start hearing the fact that we've got new avenues to explore with that. So then going back to roadside inspection, as far as drivers that are going out and they're doing their roadside inspection, what kind of steps would you say that you would start to recommend to ensure that drivers are having a smooth process with their roadside inspection? And do you have any misconceptions that you'd really like to clear up as far as what that process looks like, what it is that they're going through, maybe some of the violations that come with that they could be being hit with that they don't think they should be getting, that maybe something that happened with the carrier or with the fleet really led to occurring?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to roadside inspections, planning is key. This kind of goes back to being proactive. Not just fleets, drivers can be proactive too, in the sense of understanding ahead of time of what to expect if you get pulled over for a roadside inspection. You can find this information, again, readily available online about what to expect. There are certain things that an officer is going to want to see in a roadside inspection, and we see so many violations stem from drivers just not having expected that and then being unable to provide what the officer needs to see. You can avoid that by just taking a little bit of time ahead of time to understand what the officer is going to want to see, and then making sure that when you're driving down the road, you know where you can find that if you need to find it. And some of the classic examples are going to be obviously your driver's license, your CDL, your registration information for your vehicle, the classic things we all expect, even if we're driving our personal vehicle, that's going to have to be made available. But then for commercial drivers, you can expect that the law enforcement officer is going to want to see a copy of your med card. They're going to want to see your shipping paper documents. If they're going to do an inspection of your logs, which is often the case, they're going to want to see your logs. And if you're running an ELD, they're going to expect that you be able to electronically transfer your logs to them. And so what that means is that you need to understand how to do that process. So many violations get written up for drivers being unable to transfer their electronic logs. And had they spent the time with their carrier to understand how that process is accomplished, they could have avoided that violation. And so make sure you understand how to use your ELD device and how to transfer your logs to law enforcement. And then the other common violations we see for missing stuff, along with the ELD rule, requires drivers to have certain things available with them in the cab, namely your instruction manual for your ELD, instructions for how to transfer the logs to law enforcement, and then a blank supply of driver logs, paper logs, available to use in case your ELD goes down for one reason or another. And so you'll see that written up on many roadside inspection reports where drivers weren't able to produce those things. And so just knowing where those are in the cab of your vehicle, and sometimes they're on the device themselves. You can access the instruction manual right from your ELD device. But yeah, just taking the time to understand what's going to be asked of you, and then making sure you know where those things are, and then you can give them to the officer upon demand. That's going to go a long way to keeping you out of violations in that roadside inspection. Also, a couple of other tips that drivers don't realize could be a problem, but are often a problem. Keep your seatbelt on and don't be messing around in the cab until after the officer has come up and talked with you and told you to do something. We see so many seatbelt violations written up where the driver was wearing the seatbelt, but they took it off before the officer came up to the cab, and now the officer sees them not wearing a seatbelt. I think that's an unfair violation, but it happens all the time. So you can avoid that if you're a driver just by keeping your seatbelt on until the officer gets up there and starts talking to you. Same with your glasses. If you wear corrective lenses, and that's a restriction you have on your CDL that you have to be wearing corrective lenses, leave those on until the officer comes up and talks to you. Sometimes we'll see drivers take them off so that they can see around the cab to start getting stuff ready for the officer. But then we see them get written up for not wearing the corrective lenses because they didn't have them on when the officer came up to the side of the truck. Again, I think that's an unfair violation, but we see it pretty commonly. So those are just a few tips.
Those are things I never even would have thought of. And I mean, even in my personal vehicle, that's one of the first things that I do whenever I get pulled over is I go ahead and unbuckle my seatbelt and go to lean over and start pulling everything out of my glove box because, everything that's not supposed to be in there is shoved in there too. So I completely get that. And it does seem to be an unfair violation, but definitely a good pointer for drivers that are out there that don't want to end up getting something stuck on them that shouldn't be, for sure. So being in the industry for over 15 years now, what are some of the gaps that you still see that exist as far as safety and compliance has evolved over the last couple of years, and what's still lacking there?
It kind of goes back to just looking at the trends in the data over the last several years. Even though the rules change occasionally, they don't change dramatically over a short period of time. And so it's still the common suspects that you see causing trouble for fleets and drivers when it comes to non-compliance. Not having the right type of license is still a very common issue that comes up. Usually that will happen when, maybe you're a driver that just has an operator's license and you're working for like a construction company or a landscape company, and you're used to driving vehicles or combinations that weigh under the weight threshold that would require a CDL, but then you put a large trailer on the back of your truck, and now all of a sudden you're operating a combination that requires a CDL, and you don't have one. That's a very common violation that we see, and that's something that could be avoided easily by either just not pulling that combination or getting the right type of license. So licensing violations, med card violations, expired documents violations are all very common. Make sure you keep those things up to date, your licenses and your med cards. Some of the other common violations, very common hours of service violations. Obviously, not a whole lot to say there other than these rules have been in effect for years at this point. You should understand what rules you're subject to. It's not going to be an excuse that you just ran out of hours while you were driving down the road. That's something that's a common misconception I hear of drivers all the time, particularly in the personal conveyance status issue that we talked about earlier, is they've heard along the way through the grapevine that if they run out of hours while they're driving down the road, they can flip themselves into personal conveyance status and get to a safe haven. There's no such thing as that. The only time you could do that is if you run out of hours while you are loading or unloading, and then the shipper or the receiver tells you you can't stay here. That's the only allowable time where you can flip to personal conveyance status and get to the next safe resting location. That is not designed to accommodate situations where you just, due to poor planning, you're still out on the road and you run out of hours. That's not going to get you out of a violation, and worse, that's going to end up with a log falsification violation for you. But just make sure you understand the rules under which you are operating. And again, plenty of resources available to that. But yeah, taking some time to understand the rules, figure out where the traps are, and making sure you're setting yourself up for success in that regard.
Absolutely. And I feel like that's a fair harp, especially when you're dealing with somebody's livelihood, and their livelihood is their CDL. And there are so many regulations that are out there. I mean, when you've got professionals like yourself who are willing to come in and break it down and really make it a lot easier to digest than just being handed this book of regulations and saying, here, read all of this, when a lot of people don't have time to do that. Instead, you're willing to come out here and say, okay, but in English, this is what it says. And this is what we're supposed to be doing and what you need to be following. There's really no excuse at that point as to why we're not going out and figuring it out. So for new drivers that are entering the industry, what's one compliance tip that you really wish that they knew from the start? One thing that would just set them off on the right foot and maybe keep them out of trouble later on down the road?
For new drivers coming into the industry, one thing that I've seen a lot of fleets do that I wish more fleets would do, that maybe if you're a new driver into the industry, you could seek out fleets who do this. I tend to see fleets who are doing the best from a safety and compliance standpoint are the fleets that invest in their new drivers, in the sense of either putting them through a more involved orientation process, more than just 24 hours with us and then slap on the butt and say good luck to you. Fleets that are spending a week 2 weeks, 3 weeks with their drivers tend to have better results from a compliance standpoint. And then also the fleets that are teaming their new drivers up with experienced drivers who have gone through all of these issues, who understand what a roadside inspection would involve, who understand how to do a thorough enough pre-trip inspection. That combination of new drivers with experienced drivers seems to be pretty invaluable in making sure that drivers new to the industry kind of get a sense of what to expect in terms of these traps that could end up catching them in matters of noncompliance.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So now the big question across pretty well every industry right now is the fact that we have a new administration that's taking office. What regulatory changes do you think that truck drivers as well as carriers should be anticipating at this point? And how do you think that they can prepare?
Yeah, I mean, first thought here is that the good news is we have kind of some experience with this administration in the past, right? Pretty unprecedented to have a new president and a new administration that have already been in office in the past. And so we kind of can forecast what trucking companies and their drivers might be able to or might expect under this new administration, because we had 4 years worth of that same administration. And so what we saw back then under the previous Trump administration was, first of all, from a regulatory standpoint, many may remember that when Trump first took office in 2016, he implemented what I think he called his 2-for-1 rule for federal agencies. It essentially said that if a federal agency wants to implement a new regulation, for every new regulation that they want to implement, they have to identify 2 existing regulations that they can get rid of. And so that was the 2-for-1 rule. And even though Trump hasn't come out directly, as far as I know, and said that he's going to do something similar in January of 2025 when he takes office again, I imagine that he will do something similar, especially when you look at him, having Elon Musk teaming up with him and coming up with his Department of Government Efficiency and looking at ways to cut back on the federal bureaucracy and cutting back on rulemaking. So, generally speaking, that's what you can anticipate with a Republican administration. Generally, is kind of a rollback of regulation, at least at the federal level. And particularly with Trump, with things like that, with his 2-for-1 rule and this new agency, watchdog agency that he is setting up, I think that's what we can expect is, generally speaking, less emphasis on federal regulations. Now, does that mean we're not going to have any enforcement of the federal regulations? Of course not. We're still going to see enforcement in the key areas that we've already talked about: hours of service, driver qualification, vehicle maintenance. Of course, we're still going to have that. But what I think you can probably expect if you're a fleet or a driver is maybe a slowdown of new regulations on topics that haven't historically been regulated.
And anything that you think that we need to be doing as far as, like I said, those carriers or those drivers to prepare in advance for that, or just kind of wait and see what happens as it rolls out?
There are still things that are on the regulatory docket that FMCSA, as with all federal agencies, occasionally publishes its agenda of what it hopes to accomplish over a certain time period. And so we know the things that are on the FMCSA's regulatory agenda, things like the way it gives safety ratings to motor carriers. That's on the agenda. Speed limiters have been on the agenda for many years, and that just keeps getting kicked down the road. I think it's been kicked down the road now until May of 2025, the last I saw. And that's not even to say that that's when they would go into effect. That's just when the FMCSA plans to revisit that rulemaking. But yeah, I mean, those are the big things that are on the agenda and have been on the agenda. And so I think, just kind of reading up on those topics and figuring out what it is that the FMCSA may be planning to do in those areas is worthwhile. Some of these things get opened up for public comments, and I always recommend to fleets and drivers, if you have something to say about these rulemakings that the FMCSA is planning to move ahead with, then exercise your right to go in there and file a public comment. If we don't file our public comment, then we don't really have anything to say on the back end of these rules when they get implemented and enforced against us. So that's your chance to go in and make a difference potentially.
Absolutely. And Brandon, as a podcast host yourself, what's a standout moment or lesson from your own time hosting your TruckSafe Live that shaped your approach to the industry advocacy and the things that you've done during your own time here?
Yeah, I mean, interesting question. We've been doing our podcast now for almost 4 years. Over that period of time, we've had a lot of great guests on. In terms of kind of shaping my approach to the industry, we occasionally do our shows on site at different locations. And we've done a couple of our shows in the past at some of the major industry conferences. We've done a couple of our shows at the Truckload Carrier Association safety and security events, for example. And I think that going to those events and experiencing those events and all that they have to offer and the networking that comes with those is probably the biggest thing that has shaped my approach to these things. I can't stress enough the importance of those events and networking in the industry, particularly if you're a fleet, and taking advantage of the resources that come out of those. Again, going back to this whole theme of keeping up to speed on educational resources that are available to you. I think those types of events are pretty invaluable to that. And then there are certainly those events that are available to drivers as well. We've got the Mid-America Truck Show, MATS. I think it's usually in Louisville. That's a great event, huge event. I've been to that a couple of times, and they have a lot of great educational sessions throughout, including some that are put on by the FMCSA directly. So yeah, I think that's it. I think that's the lesson I've learned, is to take advantage of those events, get to know folks that attend those events, and take advantage of what they have to offer.
Now, Brandon, I know I bounced you here, there, and everywhere during this episode. Is there anything that we didn't go over that you think would be really pertinent to share with the audience, or anything that's just sitting on your heart that you would like to get out there?
I could talk about DOT compliance for days, and I have done that. But, if you're interested in keeping up to speed on these things, we've got a lot of resources available for that purpose, specifically a lot of free resources. So if you want to check it out, you can check it out at TruckSafe.com. Again, our podcast, TruckSafe Live, is available wherever you get your podcast. And so we hope to see you through one of those channels.
Absolutely. And Brandon, for any of the listeners out there who are looking to connect with you specifically, where is it? What platforms? Where would you like for them to find you?
Yeah, we're active on all the platforms, LinkedIn particularly. If you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, would love to see you over there. You can also just reach out to us directly on our website, TruckSafe.com, and happy to figure out how we may be able to help you.
Sounds great. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate all of your insight. This has been a super educational episode, and I appreciate everything that you have to share.
Thanks, Chelsea. Appreciate the invite.
Thanks so much for joining us on this episode of Drive. For more from HandledNow, Chelsea, and myself, head to HandledNow.com and sign up for our newsletter. You can also join our Facebook group called The Driver's Seat and follow us on LinkedIn. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.